Hi, it's Dr. Steve from Misericordia University. Welcome to Introduction to VBA Coding and Setting Up PowerPoint. In this brief video, let's begin by seeing how to set up PowerPoint to accept VBA coding. And then let's take a very brief overview of how VBA works, the very basics, and the essence of VBA coding. The first thing that we have to do is to enable macros to play within PowerPoint. So to make this happen, start in PowerPoint and click on File, and on the very bottom left-hand panel will be Options, right at the bottom. So select File, Options, and then you'll see this screen, this dialog. You'll see Trust Center, and click on Trust Center Settings. When you do, you have to select to enable all macros. In other words, we want the macros to be able to play, otherwise the Visual Basic will never work. After you have enabled macros to play, now within PowerPoint, we have to set it up so you can find the Visual Basic editor. To begin, click on File and once again Options, and this time we're going to click on Customize the ribbon, and on the right hand side you may have to scroll down depending how many options are showing. Select the Developer tab. When you turn this on, this is now going to enable another tab to open in Visual Basic, so it'll be part of the regular ribbon setup that you see. It's display, and then from there you'll be able to access all of the Visual Basic editing tools. One procedure that is going to be different when you're creating some VBA scripting within PowerPoint is you're going to have to save it as a special file type. So I suggest as soon as you create a new PowerPoint file, save the PowerPoint file as a file that contains macros, in other words, VBA scripting, right at that point. To do this, say File Save, and then you want to say Save As, and you want to select that file type. The file type is a macro-enabled presentation, and it suggests that it's going to create it as a .pptm, and M, of course, for macros. So save that file, give it a name, and then in the future all you have to do is hit the Save button, and it'll save in that format from that point on. Now that you've turned on the Developer tab, and now that you have initially saved the file as a .pptm, a macro-enabled file, now let's click on and open the Developer tab. In the Developer tab, you'll notice in the Code area that there's a button for Visual Basic, and also in the Controls area on the right-hand side, you'll see a View Code button. And essentially, both of these will take you to the same place, to the coding area behind the scenes. Now, when you are coding, if you want to go back to the actual PowerPoint that we know, then you'll click the PowerPoint button as shown here. When you click on the VBA or the View Coding button, this is essentially the screen that's going to appear. So what we're going to do is we're going to type the VBA coding, so to speak, behind the scenes, and it's going to be associated with that PowerPoint file. So after you enter this editor, right now you have no place to type any coding. So the first thing we have to do is to select Insert and say Module. The module is where you're going to begin typing the code. Now you're ready to start creating some Visual Basic coding. At this point, let's take a brief overview of how VBA works. Let's look at the absolute basics to get started. There are three basic steps involved in creating VBA coding. Step 1 is type the VBA code in the editor that we just looked at. Let's take a brief look at some VBA code. The word sub means subroutine, and this is going to start every subroutine that we deal with in VBA. So we'll start by typing the word sub, and then we make up a name. So this is the name of the subroutine, and then these two parentheses, we'll put them there, but what they refer to is if we're sending different variables, other information to be accepted in here, then we would actually type something within those parentheses. For the most part, as a teacher, we're just going to create them. So I made up this name called display message box. And then I'm going to end it with the word end sub. Then in between the sub and the end sub, this is where we place our coding. Notice that the coding is indented. You'll find that the VBA editor kind of feels like it's live, because once you start typing, it's going to suggest different commands, different words. If you put sub, it's going to put an end sub automatically for you, so you'll feel like you're interacting live with the machine. So step 1 in creating VBA code is to create sub, end sub, this subroutine, and then we'll start putting our commands here in this, in between those two areas. Step 2 involves associating the macro that you just created with a button or other object on a slide in PowerPoint. So step 2 involves leaving the VBA editor. So you click the PowerPoint button, go back into regular PowerPoint, and create, if you did not already, a button on a slide. And then we have to open up the action settings. You'll recall that all you have to do is say insert and then find action settings in the ribbon. And then that's going to, having selected the button first, and then say insert action settings, and now it's going to display this dialog, and the piece that we're going to look for is run a macro. And when you select run macro by pressing that radio button, you'll find a listing or a menu, a drop down of all the macros you have created. So in step 2, we go into action settings and we associate the macro we created with this button back in PowerPoint. And step 3, you probably have already done. You save the PowerPoint file, remember, as a macro-enabled presentation, PPTM. So you have to set that save type, but that's why I already suggested do that right up front before you start doing any coding, because it's very easy to forget. And if you forget this piece, then your coding will not be saved. And then you simply run the PowerPoint as you normally would by pressing F5 or saying slideshow, run the show. That's all there's to it. Before we get started in coding in VBA, let me share with you several coding tips. Number 1, make sure that you indent the code. You saw that we started with the word sub and then finished with end sub. If the coding tool does not indent for you, hit the tab to indent that coding. That makes it a whole lot easier to read. Take note of the VBA editor's suggestions. Once you start typing, the VBA editor is going to suggest different words. To accept one of their suggestions, simply press the space bar and it will type the rest of it in for you. Another thing that's good for all coders to do and to be aware of in any coding language is to make some comments to yourself as needed. After you spend some time thinking about what you want to do and how you want it to function, and you come up with some really good coding, you don't want to have to think back through it. So to make some notes to yourself will help you when you go back to debug that code, or you go back to maybe take some of that code and use in another application. How do you do it in VBA? at the end of a line of code, so you don't want to do this at the beginning because it will comment out that entire line. Simply at the end of the line, put a single quote. So a single quote followed by any text. That text will be disregarded by Visual Basic. And in essence, it becomes just text. It's a comment to yourself as the coder. Use that anytime that it makes sense to log something in for your future awareness. Here's another helpful tip to help you locate objects and name them on a slide. In the regular Home tab of the ribbon, on the far right in the Editing group, choose Select and Selection pane to display a listing of every object that's on a slide. In doing regular PowerPoint, you probably never used this before because there was no need to really access this. But when you do this, you'll see the name of every object on the slide, and then you can rename these objects as you choose. And that becomes very significant in VBA, because in Visual Basic, we need to refer to objects by their name. You also notice that there's a little eyeball by each object, and by clicking that, we can also hide that object, and we can work within VBA coding in order to display that object later. So knowing about that selection pane will be very helpful as you start coding. One more helpful item before we actually start coding in our next video, and that is I'm going to create and I'm going to update for you what I call my VBA coding cheat sheet. This way, you don't have to memorize all the syntax, all the commands, and in some cases you can even copy and paste the coding right from this coding cheat sheet, as I call it, to help you in creating some multimedia applications within PowerPoint. The key is to be able to know how to do this, and then you can draw coding from this source, and you can also find different sources online of different code and different scripting that you can tap into. So you'll find this coding cheat sheet in Blackboard. I hope you enjoyed getting an overview of VBA and how to set up PowerPoint to accept VBA coding. In our next videos, let's begin VBA coding.